Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today's podcast will feature 3 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Don't Mess with Doug, and it's about a criminal who picks the wrong house. The second story you'll hear is called The Ring, and it's truly so horrifying. It sounds like something out of a horror movie. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Strange Calls, and it's about a fishing trip that turns into a complete nightmare for 4 men. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to mow the follow button's grass, but do it in a totally disorganized fashion, leaving huge chunks of uncut grass. Okay, let's get into our first story called Don't Mess with Doug. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1996, Doug Wills and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was very cool about it. There was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, "What are you doing here?" And immediately, the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house. And he looked in their driveway and he saw that Kristen wasn't home and it looked like nobody was home. And so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation, the idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, "Did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him?" And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight, and so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, "Okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights." And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long, the two of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion. She came running down the stairs and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement, where he tied him up to a pole and then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline. And so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then, after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead. And Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out, because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so, he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table. Then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor. He didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs, so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so, as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom. And he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell. He took him about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so, as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds. He just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other to miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle, and Doug sees that. He grabs the pistol and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1996. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. Our next story is called The Ring. In May of 2011, 27-year-old Michalina Lewandowska was surprised when she got a text message from her on-again, off-again boyfriend, 27-year-old Marcin Kasperza. The pair had actually previously been engaged and had a 3-year-old son together, but they just could never seem to make it work for longer than a couple of months at a time. In the text message, Marcin was asking Michalina if he could take her shopping, something he knew she liked to do. As for Michalina lately, she had been turning down requests like this one from Marcin, and she was inclined to at first. But their son was already being looked after by her mother, and Michalina didn't have plans that day, and so she thought, you know what? What the heck? And so she said yes. So Michalina took a shower and got ready, and even put on her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, and then she waited by the door. A little while later, Marcin, who was an aspiring bodybuilder who had become addicted to taking steroids, showed up at her Huddersfield, England home. Michalina opened the door, Marcin came inside, and then, as soon as the door shut behind him, he TAS'd Michalina. He jumped on top of her and then he bound and gagged her. And then once she was restrained on the ground with no idea what was going on, Marcin opened the front door and waved down to his car that was parked on the curb. And one of his friends, this 18-year-old named Patrick, came out and walked up to the house and came inside. And then Patrick and Marcin worked together to cram Michalina into the small, rugged cardboard box. And then, Once she was forced inside of there, they closed it up, taped it shut, and then brought the box down to the front of the house and put it into Marcine's trunk. And then Marcine and Patrick hopped in the front two seats of the car and drove off. Once they reached the outskirts of town, they parked in a parking lot right next to this huge forest. And from there, they took the box with Michelina inside of it and 2 shovels and walked into the woods. And at some point, they left the path and walkway away from where anybody would normally be, until they felt like they were far enough away that no one would see them. And at that point, they put Michelina down and then, using their shovels, they dug a grave. Once it was deep enough, they put Michelina and her box inside of the grave, and then they covered her back up with dirt and then put a 90-pound log on top of her. And then the 2 of them just walked away, leaving Michelina to die in the box. Michelina was not dead yet, but she knew if she attempted to escape with Marcine and Patrick right above her, they would just kill her on the spot, or they would dig an even deeper hole and then it would be impossible to get out again. And so, after waiting an agonizingly long amount of time to ensure Marcine and Patrick had gone, Michelina jumped into action. She immediately tried to wriggle her way out of her restraints. But the position they had forced her into, which was basically the fetal position with her hands tied behind her back, it didn't allow her to move very much into any one direction. And so, without any movement, she could not get herself to come free of these restraints. And so, as she's struggling, trying to figure out what she's going to do, she realizes she had chosen to wear her engagement ring that Marcine had given her, something she never wore anymore, and she could potentially use the diamonds and then the ring to cut through the tape that was keeping her wrists tied together. And so she began working that ring until finally she did cut through her restraints and her hands were free. And so she managed to force both of her arms right in front of her body, and then once they were in front of her, she immediately began scratching and clawing at the cardboard right above her, and eventually she scratched a hole in the box itself and dirt began pouring in on her, and she was already very low on oxygen. She was fighting off unconsciousness by remembering that her 3-year-old son needed her, and she had no idea what Marcine was going to do to him. And so she just kept on digging and fighting as the dirt's coming in on her and she's struggling to breathe. And then finally she pokes all the way through and she can see sunlight. And fresh air comes into the hole. She can breathe again. And then with this huge surge of adrenaline, she forces herself and manages to push all the way up through this hole until she's standing in her grave. And from there, she pulls herself up and out of the dirt and she runs towards the road where she flags down a motorist. And the motorist would call police and then wait with her until they arrived. After Marcine was arrested, the story came out that he had heard a rumor that Michelina was going to be leaving him and going back to Poland with their son. And he didn't want that, so he had decided he was going to kill her. Marcine was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And Patrick was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called Strange Calls. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed the throttle down, nothing really happened and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap. And Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the 2 brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually, Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat. But compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so, as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because, really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe, and Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taking the wheel that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second-guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle of the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out. And it was very clear, to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem, and so Billy Joe began cussing. He's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other two to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below, and the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped, because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other two fishermen to get up. And so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water, and so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm gonna call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel, he grabs the radio, and Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And as that was happening, Nathan and the other two fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into the ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then, all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So, nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking. And without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck. They grabbed their inflatable life raft. They blew it up, chucked it over the side. They grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft. They all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all 4 men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation, and even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back, Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know, but it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when, after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. It was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer. And then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the four men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out, it just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all four men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by. And it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all four of them at once. Which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they had to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. I mean, totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean just drift farther and farther away from them, because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened, and so quickly. And also, what were they going to do? I mean, they're in the worst possible situation. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. I mean, we're not talking days here. This is going to be quick, and all these guys knew that. And so, as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's going to stay in the water and who's going to stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the four men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other three could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time. And Nathan told him, I'm going to swim to the wreckage. I'm going to swim back to the hull of our sinking ship and I'm going to fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away, just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy, Joe, and the other three were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hole. You're not going to make it. Now just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm going to give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do 5-mile open ocean swim, and then also we did a whole bunch of 2-mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us. We had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction. We had food, we had water. We were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all the salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean. Again, even with all the right stuff in place, and you gotta remember, Nathan is this big guy. He's got this big bulky life vest on that's gonna make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically, when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also, It's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that, basically, there was like a 0% chance the swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually going to make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. What he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other two. And so, even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not going to make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you, and then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming. And he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration. From hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds. He climbed up onto this hull and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep because the whole time he's thinking, you know, this thing could sink under the water at any point and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it. Or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull. You know, not really sure what's going to happen, but here he's just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up the next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean. He sees in the direction he had come from this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, you know, he rubs his eyes. He can't believe it. He's thinking, there's no way there's already a ship out here, you know. We're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away, you know. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where this ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other two fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then, about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry, but instead what he did is he thought, they're going to be here in a minute. I'm finally just going to close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him, at some point, had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan. They scooped him up and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, you know, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other two fishermen. And certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there. You know, he swam back to the hull of the ship. We gotta go find him. And so certainly, a rescue effort would be on the way. And it was true, a rescue boat had come out and found Nathan. So everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside. And he's looking around, he can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other two fishermen? Then why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face, and eventually, they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, what freighter? It would turn out Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining two crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of a, basically, any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there, beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist. And it was possible that Nathan in his very deteriorated state had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant he definitely saw the ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour-long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it, but again, there was just no proof. And so, nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billy Joe or the others. And so eventually, the search was called off, and unfortunately, the presumption was Billy Joe and the other two were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so, anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with a sense of hope that this time it's going to be different. Their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish, and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller intermittently, throughout their rapid Spanish, began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat. The name, the phone number in English, over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then, before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billy Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English. And what he heard was his own name, followed by his phone number over and over again. Basically, the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then, before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank, or a wrong number, or just a really weird coincidence. But to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other, and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fishermen, because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, the phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house. And it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number. Just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls. And they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. Because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billy Joe and the others. And maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back. Hone. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories. But it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billy Joe and the others were missing that, in theory, could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again, to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense. But the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billy Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billy Joe and the missing fishermen. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billy Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that, until March 6th, 1991. So almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billy Joe and the others went missing, on that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home and she answered it. And it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities, and again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fishermen. And then after this call, there was a near-constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there and someday they will come back home. And the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion. A quick note about our stories, they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On a cold evening in early February of 2010, a group of friends gathered around the table at a restaurant in a French ski resort. They had spent their whole day out on the slopes, skiing and snowboarding, and they were now warming up by the fire with some warm drinks. Just then, one of their cell phones buzzed, and when this person looked down at their phone, they immediately frowned. Then, they excused themselves from the group and stepped away to go talk. When this person came back from that conversation, they were visibly pale and their hands were shaking. And to the others who noticed this, they asked them what was wrong, but this person just shook their head, grabbed their coat, and said they had to leave right now. Someone they cared deeply about needed their help. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the follow button's house and replace their foam in their mattress with rocks. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 6, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lalou set up the ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could smell the beef bourguignon simmering on the stove, but Alan and the 37-year-old woman who was cooking the beef bourguignon were not talking. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and Alan had actually bought this house for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra used to be Alan's assistant, but over the years they had developed a really close relationship that was much more like father to daughter. Now, Alexandra had not worked for Alan in a number of years, but, they remained close. And also, remember Alan literally bought her this house. And so as a result of this bond they had, Alan found himself visiting her quite a bit at this house. Helping out where he could, and he also paid for her car and also for their vacations. And Alan could afford to be this generous because he was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a huge moneymaker in France. Lots of companies booked circus shows for end-of-the-year parties for their employees, and Alan had lots of major contracts. And so as a result, Alan's office was in this fancy chateau in the countryside, and his wife actually lived in this luxury ski town near the Swiss border. And Alan was constantly traveling all over Europe for work. But this life could also be a grind. Just in the past 24 hours, Alan had traveled more than 1,200 miles, meeting with potential clients and scouting new performers. So he put a lot of value on the time where he could escape to Alexandra's house where he could recharge in the quiet of the suburbs and, obviously, spend time with somebody he cared a lot about. Now Alan knew all of his friends and co-workers thought that he and Alexandra were blatantly having an affair here, and he was sure that's what his own wife assumed too. And this was fair because, after all, Alan did have lots of extramarital relationships. He also engaged with sex workers all the time, and he really didn't even try to hide any of it. He and his wife Elizabeth, they lived in separate homes. And they sort of had this understanding that she can have this life and he can have this life and he can have this life in exchange. However, Alan's relationship with Alexandra really was different. It had always been platonic. They'd never even kissed or held hands. Alan had no kids of his own, and he genuinely enjoyed playing the role of, doting father and grandfather to Alexandra and her daughter respectively. But now they were in this big fight, and Alan was anxious to repair it. Alexandra's daughter was out of the house for the weekend, so he and Alexandra had planned to have this nice dinner tonight before Alan had to head out again on business on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, somewhat stupidly, had brought up Alexandra's past, and it ended up getting into this horrible fight, and they just continued to yell at each other ever since. Alexandra was very defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris and she had fallen in love and she had had a baby. But the baby had tragically died and her relationship with Hurlef had fallen apart. And so she had spiraled into very self-destructive behavior by the time Alan finally met her in 2002. So this is 8 years before they were in this house having this big fight. Alexandra was really struggling by this point. She had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was really struggling to provide for her because all she could muster in terms of work was, this combination of minimum wage jobs and side hustles. And so when Alan had hired her as his, full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. But, deep down, sometimes she seemed more resentful of Alan's power than grateful for his help. It's like he had total control over her well-being, and she didn't necessarily like that. And so with that as context, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen, hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could actually have a real conversation here. And so once he was in the kitchen, he sort of looked over at Alexandra and couldn't really tell where she was at. And then he turned, opened up the fridge, and just kind of stared inside of it, not really looking for any food or drink or anything. He was just hoping that Alexandra would say something to him. And to his relief, Alexandra did turn around and kind of playfully swung her dish towel at him, telling him that he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad at him anymore, so Alan felt very relieved. And he smiled and closed the fridge, and then he told her to come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the laundry to dry so she could iron it. A few minutes later, they both sat down on the sofa with their wine glasses, and Alexandra asked Alan how business was going. He told her it was good, which technically it was good. This company was on track to bring in around $4 million that year, which is the equivalent of about $5 million. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was pretty stressed. He made the majority of his money through contracts with companies, but he was not the only person competing for those lucrative contracts. One competitor was another circus owner whose name was Michel de la Rue, and recently Michel had been beating Alan on one contract after another. And it was starting to feel to Alan like Michel was actually targeting Alan's contracts. trying to steal them from him rather than trying to cultivate his own clients. Alan told Alexandra that on Monday he had a very important meeting in Vichy, which is a city in central France, about a 4-hour doctor south of Alexandra's house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to win a big contract as long as Michelle didn't steal it out from under him. Alexandra put her hand on Alan's arm and told him, "Don't worry," she said. She was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success and they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip that he had booked for the two of them and heard Anna. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to go do the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan just kind of sat by himself for a minute. He was looking forward to the vacation that she had mentioned, and Bart, because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately with her new boyfriend, a 42-year-old engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Now Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that, Alexandra and Yves were getting pretty serious. They might even get married, and Alan couldn't help but worry that eventually, if that happened, Yves might start to resent him for sort of stepping in as this paternal figure in Alexandra's life, that perhaps he would come off as being sort of overbearing. But he was not going to let that fear wreck the evening. So, as Alexandra came back now with the laundry, he picked up a book from the coffee table and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, headed back out of town. But what no one would realize until much later was there was actually a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lelou's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and she heard the voice of Alan's assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. And she said she was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. And this was pretty strange because Alan was not the type of person to just disappear from work without telling his secretary. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that, no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. And then she asked Sylvie, why, what's going on here? And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's answer, she felt herself growing really nervous because apparently Alan had this very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had not shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he was supposed to be staying. Sylvie said she had already reached out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him, and he was not answering the repeated phone calls to both of his cell phones, which appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days on his various phones. She couldn't even recall a time when he'd been unreachable, even briefly. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she called, but she would take it from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and called the police. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. Now, up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case, with the local police in Alan's wife's hometown handling the inquiry, which was pretty basic. But now enough time had passed without Alan being found and no evidence coming in that the original report had been kicked over to the crime division, because they were thinking this could potentially be a kidnapping or something worse. This young officer was here at this home because it was the last place Alan was known to be before he went missing. The door of the home opened, and a thin blonde woman looked out. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she said yes. When he explained to her why he was there, Alexandra looked immediately concerned and invited him inside. And as she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking stock of the space. It was clean but a bit cluttered, with toys that appeared to belong to a young girl scattered about. The officer scanned for any signs of a physical fight or violence of some kind, like damage to the walls or the furniture, but there was nothing that stood out, nothing concerning. Alexandra began asking the officer pretty anxiously all these questions about, what was going on with Alan? Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What do you know? But the young officer just shook his head and said for now they really didn't know much. He was just here to try to build a timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so, speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alan. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to rattle off all the details she could remember. She said that Alan was like a surrogate father to her and he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had been there on Friday, also on Saturday and Sunday. And then he had taken off on that Sunday because he had to go to Vichy for this big meeting on Monday. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him. But that was pretty typical. She said their relationship was not remotely romantic. It really was platonic. And he didn't always check in the way, a spouse would have been convinced. This is more like really close friends. The officer nodded while he wrote down what she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and appropriately worried. But he was suspicious of the idea that she and Alan were not romantically involved at all. So before he left, he asked to see the rest of her house, in part just to see what her reaction would be. If she said no or got defensive, he would probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed, and she actually took him all around the house, showing him anywhere he wanted to go. And what he found is the rest of the house seemed just as normal as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the door and promised him she would call if Alan reached out. And so after leaving Alexandra's house to be thorough, the officer actually went door to door up and down Alexandra's street, asking her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend and over the past several days, seeing if there was anything that contradicted what Alexandra had said. But everybody more or less confirmed Alexandra's story. Alan was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question and said that really nothing had seemed off. So eventually, the officer just left and went back to the station. And when he got there, he wrote a report highlighting Alan's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alan's wife lived, followed up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Alan's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions, which all showed no activity after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and his friends, but no one had heard anything. And they even put in a request to the car company Audi for the GPS data that was stored in Alan's car, which was an Audi Q7. Now, the investigators knew it was entirely possible that Alan had chosen to disappear. I mean, he was very wealthy. He had lots of connection. That was a possibility that he had basically chosen to be gone. And if that was the case, it would be pretty difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so, whether Alan's disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of foul play, the police knew finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even look for Alan. On February 26, 2010, so 19 days since Alan was reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orleans, France, looking at Alan's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that police had requested from Audi had come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising place. So again, the last place where Alan was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola, near Chartres, France, and heading to Vichy, France for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered in the parking lot of a train station in Orleans, which was in between those two cities. And so to the police, it sort of looked like he had gotten halfway to his destination and just stopped. Now, when they found this car, the first thing they did is they just put it under surveillance for 2 days to see if maybe Alan or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where this car was in a pretty rough area where violent crime and sex work were pretty common. So I mean, any number of people could potentially break into this car or who knows what. It just seemed like a seedy area where something might happen here if we keep watching. But nobody had shown up. So finally, they just towed the car to the impound lot for forensic technicians to process it and look for evidence. And Detective Martin was here to watch that process. The forensic tech circled the vehicle and began taking photos of the outside and also dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the outside of the car, and there were no traces of any effort to try to break into the car. Plus, Alan's briefcase and luggage were clearly still inside the car, which meant, The fact the car was found where it was likely not a product of a robbery. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car. It's here and it has nothing to do with Alan's disappearance. It seems like how this car got here is connected in some way to what happened to Alan. And, sort of going down that path, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Alan probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery was disappointingly clean, which doesn't exactly, enhance the idea that foul play happened here. It just sort of seems like what's going on. But after a few minutes after, kind of thoroughly scanning the inside of the car, one of the techs pushed the button near the driver's side that opened up the trunk. And then after it was open, Detective Martin walked around to the back to look inside and see what was in there. And what he saw was this bulky object wrapped in a pink sheet, and right away, Martin had the sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and pulled the sheet back. And pretty much immediately, Martin's suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body, a man's body, fully clothed and curled in the fetal position. There is no doubt this was Alan Malou, but there was no visible blood or wounds or bruises anywhere on his body, and there was no blood in the trunk. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Alan's body to further examine him, he found his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she did the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been pretty cold, which was good for evidence collection, because it basically meant the trunk had sort of acted like a refrigerator and preserved Alan's soft tissue. As the coroner wheeled the body away, Martin just stood there staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Alan had died. All he knew was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got to work. Since Alan's body was found in Orleans, he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and other evidence that had already been gathered by the other departments, and right away, the picture they painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with lots of suspects in multiple locations. Alan was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orleans where he had ended up. In fact, he rarely seemed to spend more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, he seemed to bounce between his office and a series of hotels, with stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she said that Alan was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so this made her the last person to see Alan alive, which in Martin's mind clearly made her a suspect right off the bat. However, Alexandra's story about Alan leaving her house on Sunday, February 6th, matched up with the data Martin had from Alan's car, cell phone, and credit card records, which all showed that Alan really did leave her house and went to Orleans on that day, and then for reasons unknown, stopped communicating or spending money. Maybe that was the day he was killed. Right off the bat, like the police officer who originally visited Alexandra and took down her original story, Detective Martin found it pretty hard to believe that her relationship with Alan was not romantic. It just seemed like, based on how frequently they apparently saw each other and the fact that Alan was buying her things and, bought her house and paid for vacations and things like that, it just seemed like there was more to the story than what he had been told. But even though that did totally cast some level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of it for Detective Martin, which is like, okay, the size difference between Alan and Alexandra was stark. I mean, Alan was 240 pounds, a really big guy, and Alexandra was just very small and petite. Now, is it impossible for her to kill him and put him in the trunk of the car in Orleans? No, but it just makes it sort of unlikely. And so that's just sort of floating in the background of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and wife had supplied. First off, Alan apparently had lots of affairs with lots of women, and so that meant every one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners of any kind connected to them, were also suspects. It also meant that Alan's wife, Elizabeth, had a motive to want her husband dead. I mean, basically he's cheating on her openly all the time. That's gotta be motivation for her to do something to him. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth literally would have done the killing herself, because she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband died. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman. And the second thing that Detective Martin got from the associates and from Alan's wife was Alan's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alan's employees and colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless business person. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had already made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was flying around. And so because Martin had been handed this murder investigation and really there's, like, an overwhelming number of people that could have been involved here, instead of just, not being sure where to start, Martin just assembled a team of his very best deputies and they set to work, literally interviewing everybody, and from that, making a list of suspects that they deemed were appropriate. 3 weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station, and he sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly apparently, very calmly. The man's name was Michel de Larue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's one suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anybody else's. And this was because immediately after Alan disappeared, Michel had begun contacting Alan's clients, trying to get them to all sign new contracts with him. Sort of a pretty cutthroat and cold thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on these contracts Michel was going for, and they added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which, in the detective's mind, was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel killed this guy specifically to gobble up these contracts. And not only that, but the coroner had by this point come back with Alan's cause of death. He had been strangled using some kind of ligature, like a rope or a belt. And it likely took between 5 and maybe 10 minutes for Alan to actually be strangled to death. So, the idea is someone's actively strangling him for that long. That is a long time to be right there on top of somebody killing someone. And then the scratches that were found on Alan's legs suggested that his body had been lifted into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, clearly took place outside of the trunk. And so all that meant whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he did fit the description. He seemed like a pretty fit, strong guy. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and body language for signs of anxiety or defensiveness that could suggest he was hiding something, what he found was Michel seemed pretty open and very straightforward, like he was not hiding a thing. Michel immediately acknowledged poaching Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. That was business. He said he was sure if somehow the positions were reversed, Alan would do the same thing to him. Then also, he said he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away skiing. And then Michel produced this folder full of these receipts and all these phone numbers, and he handed it over to Martin, who took it and he told Michel, "Okay, sit tight." And then the detective got up and he left the interrogation room and he handed over this folder to another detective to check out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to take a shot. The idea was to sort of have a good cop, bad cop sort of dynamic to see if maybe that would rattle Michel. And so Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and took a stab at, breaking Michel. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So Martin signaled for another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a sort of run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel and they didn't make any progress. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michelle in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder, and when he turned around, it was one of his deputies who told Martin that, unfortunately, he had called all the people that Michelle had given them information for, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had also even called the manager of the manager of the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michelle's alibi checked out. He clearly had not been physically able to kill Alan. He was at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he could not just keep Michelle indefinitely and just keep trying to catch him in a lie. You know, even if there was some possibility here that he was involved in this murder, at this point there just wasn't enough evidence, and so he had to let Michelle go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk, combing through reports when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was somebody at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. And this was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local papers basically saying, "Hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me," and he hoped that whoever this was potentially a witness. And so Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby, and there he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was this man who appeared to be in his early 50s, who was dressed all in black with these shiny black shoes and glasses. And Martin wondered if maybe this was a business contact of Alan's. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then this man introduced himself, and when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. Because the man said his name was Remy St. Duran, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy too, you know, "Thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this. You need to go." But then he thought better of it because Martin was really having no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car, there were no usable fingerprints, and while the bedsheet Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, they didn't match anything in their system. And then the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either, and he'd found no evidence that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles took out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with and all the sex workers he had engaged with, and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little curiosity and a lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy the psychic back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving, and when he heard it, he had a vision that was so vivid that he actually had to pull over. He said he saw Alan Lowe as clear as day in this physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name and he couldn't describe her, but he was certain that a woman was somehow involved in Alan's murder. Martin was disappointed because, unsurprisingly, this just sort of felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody parading around as a psychic who could see things that nobody else could things. It just seemed like he threw this random, generic thing out there as if it was some big revelation. And it just didn't feel like it was a... But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orleans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and actually placed in the trunk after he was dead. And this caught Martin's attention, because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transportation. But, critically, the police had not released that information to the press specifically because they wanted to be able to weed out fake tips. And so for Remy to say that, I mean, how would he have access to that? Now Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy, but it just seemed so, you know, on the nose that he began considering what else Remy had said. This idea that, okay, Alan was struggling with this woman, you know, that was something that Martin had not really considered. He had sort of ruled most women out as potential suspects because of how big Alan had been and how physical this murder had to have been. So it just seemed more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now Martin wasn't so sure, and suddenly it seemed entirely possible that, you know what, maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And then, after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk because Martin had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had lots of extramarital affairs. Now Detective Martin and his team had spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy, you know. It was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew clearly that Alan engaged with sex workers. You know, it just seemed like that was one of the things that he did, and they spoke to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as being suspects. And so, for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar, as you know, the primary suspect pool. However, now with fresh eyes, he was thinking, you know, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans was because he was there to meet a sex worker. And while he was there, something went wrong and it resulted in his death. So Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic tech had already been through it once looking at all of Alan's emails and business records, but Martin was looking at something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alan had found sex workers to go visit. Basically, what he was doing is making a true, exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever really engaged with. So this is an even bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through, and as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alan was engaging with had any connection to Orleans, and they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alan himself, at least based on the messages that were on his laptop dock. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came to one new profile, this woman named Marie, and when he took in who this woman was and got a picture of her and saw her information, he knew right then and there he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alan Lalou on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Alan, and inside they were burning with rage. Alan seemed to think he was so much better than the killer just because he was this powerful businessman and the killer was just a sex worker. And the killer had tolerated Alan's behavior because, you know, Alan had money, but now Alan had pushed it too far, and the killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Alan's belt lay nearby, and impulsively the killer grabbed it and lunged forward and looped the belt around Alan's throat. And at first Alan struggled, he reached up, he's trying to pull the belt off, he has no idea what's happening. But the killer just held on tight, and for several minutes, there's this unbelievable death struggle going on. And Alan, he's fighting. He's a big guy and he's getting close to pulling this thing off, but then something sort of unbelievable happened. The killer had sort of braced themselves against an object behind them, and so their back was up against it and they're pulling as hard as they can with this belt against Alan's throat. And as they're leaning back, the object they're up against suddenly broke, and because, you know, the killer didn't let go of the belt and is applying max pressure when they fell backwards, it created almost like this whiplash effect. Their body tumbles, and all that force is driven into Alan's throat. And what happened is that sudden whiplash crushed Alan's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so, just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Alan was dead. And when Alan did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, you know, their heart pounding, just sort of taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of this body. I mean, this is a huge guy. How are they going to get rid of it on their own? So the killer called their accomplice, and the accomplice was hundreds of miles away in a ski resort, But they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived and they helped the killer load Alan's body into the trunk of Alan's car. Then the killer climbed into Alan's car and drove it to the train station in Orleans. Behind them, as they made this ride, police would realize much later there was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Alan's car and his body in Orleans, and then together they would drive away. And shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Alan's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. Alexandra's troubled past that she was very defensive about included the fact that she was actually a sex worker under the name Marie-Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Alan had fought previously about her, troubled history. And she was especially mad that at one point Alan had implied that Alexandra's daughter could sort of end up like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on Saturday, February 6th, when Alan brought up Alexandra's daughter just sort of in conversation, for Alexandra something snapped. It just felt so disrespectful that he again was talking about her daughter. And sort of out of impulse, she grabbed the belt, wrapped it around Alan's neck, strangled him, and ultimately stumbled backwards and crushed his larynx and killed him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her, that Alan had left her house in his car on February 7th and she had then not seen him again. What she had left out was that Alan was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Alan Lewin, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released, and together they have a child who was born before Alexandra went to prison.